Microsoft allows clients to technically connect any SQL Server to Microsoft Azure. Doesn't matter where it runs, on-premise, on the service provider's estate. It can even be deployed on AWS. It allows end clients to run a specific script that installs a so-called Arc agent. And that script connects those SQL servers to Microsoft Azure and enables multiple features through that. It communicates consistently with Azure. The end clients see all the data about their SQL servers that is delivered via that agent in their own Azure dashboards. They can create SQL Server dashboards. They can consolidate all the data from various SQL servers wherever they are into that dashboard. Essentially, this is built for the end clients, not for providers. But we will still talk today about how does that benefit providers, what providers can do, what providers cannot do. I think the most important feature why end clients would want to use a SQL Server with Azure Arc is not dashboarding, is not centralized management, is the pay-as-you-go licensing. What effectively happens is when a SQL Server is connected to Azure via Azure Arc, it has an option then to be billed per hour exactly as in Azure. If somebody has temporary workloads or a necessity for elastic workloads, anything that doesn't have to be always on, they will pay less. Give them flexibility. You provide them more flexibility. You become more competitive. Please don't think about it as a replacement for SPLA. The SPLA option is still available. There's no transition to SQL with Azure Arc. It's just another thing to consider, another thing to put in your offerings. And from that point of view, it's a positive change. There are 4 ways now to license SQL Server on a hosting provider. And the most obvious one is SPLA. SPLA has been around for 20 years. You all know what SPLA is, hopefully. In SPLA, the provider is licensed to provide services with licenses bundled with this service. The licenses are on the provider uses their own keys, their own activation, and provider pays for all the SPLA licenses on a monthly basis to Microsoft and then charges their end clients for the consumed licenses and services. The billing period is 1 month. The flexibility in SPLA is attached to the calendar month. If somebody wants to run the temporary workload, if they turn it on even for 1 minute, they have to pay for the entire month. There's an option of bring your own license, which Microsoft introduced many years ago, but simplified drastically exactly 2 years ago in October 2022. Any license with software assurance or on a subscription can be brought to any service provider, shared or dedicated. The licenses can be through any licensing channel. There's no limit to CSP. It could be enterprise agreement licenses, could be CSP licenses, MPSA licenses, open value subscription licenses, as long as the license has either an active subscription or it has an active software assurance subscription as well. It can be brought to any service provider. Now, with Azure Arc, it was technically introduced more than half a year ago. And then Microsoft in May 2024 clarified the usage terms. Azure Arc with SQL Server can be used in 2 different modes. First one is a client enables Azure Arc, but wants to license it with a license. From the licensing standpoint, it works exactly as with bring your own license. It's still their Azure Arc, your end client's Azure Arc, not providers. When provider provides SQL with Azure Arc, they need to remember that it's connected to the end client's tenant, not the provider's Azure tenant. And when we talk about Azure Arc with a license, it's exactly the same as bring your own license, same licensing rules, same formulas, same licensing channels, and the minimal term is 1 year. If the end client wants to connect Azure Arc and use the pay-as-you-go option, then the minimal billing period is 1 hour, as long as it runs. We have a question. So providers cannot use Arc for their customer workloads. This is a very interesting question because you can't use your own Azure tenant if we're talking about database hosting, but you can help your end clients install SQL Server with Azure Arc, but they will pay for that Azure Arc, pay as you go, through their own Azure. So you need to effectively help them connect it, help them enable it in their Azure tenant, and then they pay for that SQL with Azure Arc, not through your typical SPLA provider's path, but through their own Azure tenant. Obviously, if you are their CSP, you get your benefits and rebates and whatnot, your margins, but it's a payment to Microsoft. These are the rules that Microsoft introduced in May. It is allowed to be hosted on hosting providers and service providers. There's no doubt about it. but because it's published in the product terms. This is why this is the benefit that was given to the end client. It's not a part of SPLA, it's not a part of service provider use rights. There is an exception for providers, we'll get to that. There is one exception for providers when the provider can use their own Azure. Please bear with me. Let's go through some of the questions that we received. Can many clients share SQL with Azure Arc? Or rather, can a SQL with Azure Arc be multi-tenant? So here's the difference. If we're talking about database hosting, for example, sharing a server, a virtual machine, or a physical machine with Azure Arc, then the answer is no, because it must belong to single tenant. The same thing applies to when you want to license the host and then share the virtual machines between multiple providers. In this case, also, the answer is no. However, if you host a SaaS application, and we work with providers that host their own SaaS solutions, hotel booking systems, financial applications, if you are an ISV, if you have an application and you want to use SQL Server when you have seasonal demands, for example, you have an e-commerce shop and just before Christmas, the traffic increases and you need more workloads, you need more power, then you can deploy temporary SQL Server instances and license them through Azure Arc. And then you will only pay per hour. So in that case, SQL Server with Azure Arc is allowed. And that is regulated by two different sets of rules. But in regards to using SQL in this configuration, the rules are very similar. If you want to use your own licenses, it's allowed by the so-called self-hosting provisions and product terms, which allow you to use certain products of Microsoft. Strictly speaking, it's only Windows Server and SQL Server, using your own volume licenses to provide hosted SaaS applications to the clients. If you're using pay-as-you-go with Azure Arc, then the same rights are granted by the so-called Azure Customer Solution. That is the only application where a provider can use their own Azure tenant and provide SQL Server to support the SaaS applications. I hope that's clear. Do you have to mix SPLA license for operating system and Arc for SQL? Or also Windows must be licensed with Arc or something else? You can mix. In the last 2 years, Microsoft allowed multiple mix and match scenarios for licensing and hosting. Azure Arc, as I said multiple times, is a bring your own license scenario. It's absolutely legitimate to use SPLA for the operating system and for some of the SQL servers to let your end clients deploy them with Azure Arc. We had a few questions about security, and since we're not a security consultancy, but I used to work in IT security, so let me give you a brief overview of what's going on. In regards to all this GDPR, NIS2 and DORA, I would have a look first at what's shared with Microsoft, what sort of information, and what can potentially be used as an attack vector or disclose your end client's information. Microsoft has a document on learn.microsoft.com where they outline every single bit of data. What you can notice straight away is Microsoft can see the server name, Microsoft can see instance names. It also collects information about databases, database names. If that is sensitive information, they will see it. You may think, okay, fine, it could be potentially used as an attack vector if Microsoft is hacked because it's stored on the Microsoft servers. One thing that doesn't make sense to me as an ex-security consultant is why they need to know TCP ports. It's a bit of an excessive information. And we had a question also whether Microsoft sees all the other installed software. So if we trust Microsoft, then no, they don't see any other installed software. The information is purely about SQL Server instances and databases. So what I suggest you doing is talk to your CISO, to your Chief IT Security Officer. Let them look into that document, read about the prerequisites, study it, maybe test something. If you are concerned about the region where your data is stored, there's a choice when you enable Azure Arc for SQL to choose the region where that data will be stored on Microsoft's Azure servers. If you want to maintain that certain region due to legislation, other regulations, there's an option like that. The data transfer, if we trust Microsoft, is outbound only. And there is an additional set of data, more than this, which is optional, which is diagnostics and monitoring data. Microsoft published all the specs. Another question we had is when it's better to use Azure Arc. I already touched on this, but let me reiterate. When an end client wants an instance that's billed per hour, what I think Microsoft effectively did is Microsoft brought licensing on the service provider closer to the benefits clients get in Azure. Because Azure, before that, was the only platform which was truly billed per hour, where you could get pay-as-you-go licensing for SQL Server. Now, an end client has an option, if they want temporary workloads, to use your data center, still pay to Microsoft though, but to use your data center to host their workloads in your data center and still have the per hour billing option. If I was a provider, I would embrace this option, because that means that my clients that need temporary workloads won't have to migrate to Azure, and I won't lose that business from them. It's brilliant for temporary workloads. I wouldn't use it for consistent, persistent workloads, because Azure Arc is exactly 20% more expensive than a normal license. It's good for elastic workloads. But remember my Christmas example. You have an e-shop, there's more traffic before Christmas. You need temporary workloads. They're called elastic in the cloud. There you go. You have Azure Arc option. Fantastic. Is it better than SPLA? Yes, because in SPLA, the minimal term is 1 month. That's good for testing as well, but for testing, we would always suggest using SQL Server Developer Edition. Can Azure Arc be licensed per physical core? Yes. It's a firm yes. It can be licensed on a standalone server per physical core, and it can also be used with SQL Server Enterprise for, if you know what unlimited virtualization is, when you license the host at the physical level, and then you can run as many SQL Server virtual machines as you want. By the way, speaking about virtual machines, there is a technical limitation that may be important. SQL installed in containers can't use Azure Arc. Server calls. So there's no option in Arc for server call. You can enable Azure Arc to have extended security updates, monitoring, centralized controls, all the other beautiful features of Azure Arc, but there is no pay-as-you-go option for the server call model. That is when we talk about the end client server call. What about SQL standard license with SaaS? Because Azure Arc is not a SPLA feature, we conclude for now that we wouldn't even suggest connecting SQL Server licensed with SaaS through SPLA to Azure Arc. Because when you license it with SaaS, you provide it as a part of the SPLA services. And therefore, it's not explicitly permitted to do so. Microsoft did not provide any comments on this scenario. And usually in the licensing world, if something is not expressly granted and explained, it doesn't exist. Will anything bad happen if you connect SQL that you provide to your own clients with SPLA SaaS to their Azure tenant for them to just have it in their monitoring console? We actually don't think it's going to end badly and anybody's going to punish you for it. It's just not allowed from the point of view of compliance. But then there is no monetary impact of connecting a SQL Server that is licensed this way just for the purposes of monitoring best practices and just basic centralized controls. If you want to be cautious, don't do it. You want to be adventurous, I'll leave it up to you. And the same applies to SQL Server Web Edition with Azure Arc. It's actually supported by Azure Arc, and it's listed in the documentation for Azure Arc as a supported edition. End clients can get it either through SPLA or from Azure. So it's supported by Azure Arc, but the considerations are exactly the same as for SQL Server Standard with SaaS. Let's wait until Microsoft clarifies this. So yes, technically it can be connected. It is supported. There's no pay-as-you-go option for SQL Server Web. It must be licensed with licenses in the traditional way. It's not explicitly permitted, if you understand what I mean. And the last question we had was whether more software will soon support Azure Arc. The answer is probably, and we actually see that as a positive tendency because it gives end clients more flexibility. As long as Microsoft doesn't take away the previous licensing options and leaves us only with this, it's a good tendency. If you want to see what they may start providing as such an option, look at what they do in Azure. If something is available as a pay-as-you-go license in Azure, it will probably be introduced as an Azure Arc option. The only possible candidate that we see is Bespoke Server for now, but we'll see. Let's wait and see. We see that Microsoft is trying to undermine SPLA. SPLA is still alive. It's promised officially to be alive until 2029. Nobody's taking SPLA from you. You can be rest assured for the next 5 years it's still here. But what Microsoft can start doing to sort of undermine it or shift the focus from SPLA is start introducing more and more options like that, where end clients would feel that it's commercially more interesting for them to get these licenses and services directly from Microsoft, even hosted on the service provider. And one of these things, by the way, that will happen, because it's promised by Microsoft in writing, will happen very soon, at least in Europe. Let's wait and see how it materializes. It's Azure Stack HCI for hosters. It's an Azure Stack HCI version that will be multi-tenant. That will be another revolutionary development. We expect it to be released in about February next year, around that time. SPLA is used when workloads are on premises. For example, with VMware on premises, But for workloads in cloud, do we have to use CSP? There's no one answer to this question. First of all, SPLA is not for on-prem. SPLA is for usage in the data center, in the service provider data center. It can be given to an end client to use on premises under certain circumstances, but that's more of an exception from the rule. AWS itself is a SPLA provider. Amazon is the biggest Microsoft SPLA partner. Nobody's even close to those numbers. Also, because Microsoft now allows lots of bring your own license options, you need to know, first of all, that on AWS, you can't host CSP licenses. But on other providers, yes, you can host CSP licenses. Amazon, Google, and Alibaba have limitations compared to all the other service providers. Some of the SPLA licenses can be brought to another service provider, including Amazon. To answer your question, we would need to see an exact scenario of what you're trying to achieve, and then we'll be able to tell you whether that's possible or not, and even suggest you maybe an alternative because maybe it's cheaper, maybe it's better.